Thank you all for joining us for this webinar hosted by Sustainable Energy for All and the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, South Africa. My name is Divyam Nagpal. I work within the Green Industrialization team at SE for All, leading our work on the Africa Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative, or as we call it, or Africa REMI. Through Africa REMI, we are essentially working with governments, industry, skilling institutions, and financiers to support the development of local value chains for solar PV, batteries, and electric vehicles on the continent. We've largely been working in Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa, but really looking this year also to expand our work to additional countries on the continent. Today's webinar is the fourth in a series we launched last year to catalyze dialogue on what really it will take to strengthen renewable energy manufacturing in Africa. Earlier webinars in the series focused on industrial policy design, including the role of trade, as well as SEZs. But today we focus on South Africa, an industrial powerhouse on the continent, and the opportunity it presents for building competitive supply chains for renewable energy, batteries, and EVs, not just to meet local demand, but also building for the region and the world. I must say that we couldn't have chosen a better date and time for this webinar. This morning, the Cabinet approved the South Africa Renewable Energy Master Plan, which really looks to build renewable energy and energy storage value chains by 2030. And I'm quite excited that we have many of the architects and contributors to the master plan joining us today, and I'm sure we will hear a lot more about how SAREM really provides an impetus to building those local value chains in South Africa. With that, allow me to invite Mr. Stefano Marguccio, Deputy CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, to deliver the opening remarks, please. Stefano, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Divyam. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this amazing discussion. It's my pleasure to deliver the opening remarks of this fourth webinar in the Africa Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative South-South Virtual Policy Dialogue Series, which is a very long name. We at Sustainable Energy for All are excited to organize today's webinar in partnership with Invest SA and the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, DTIC, spotlighting South Africa as an investment destination for renewable energy manufacturing. Today's conversation is timely as global South countries, including South Africa, are prioritizing domestic renewable energy manufacturing as a core pillar of their energy transition and green industrialization strategies. Developing local manufacturing is not just about reducing import dependency. It is about unlocking economic opportunities, leveraging existing production capacities and resources, and creating jobs across the entire value chain of key technologies, including solar PVs, batteries, and electric vehicles. South Africa has been at the forefront building domestic renewable energy manufacturing capacity, deploying a range of industrial policy tools alongside its renewable energy procurement program to attract global original equipment manufacturers and foster a local ecosystem of suppliers and service providers. More recently, as we heard from Divyam, the South Africa Renewable Energy Master Plan, SAREM, has been developed to reinvigorate the sector, focusing on green industrialization and job creation. South Africa's G20 presidency is also emerging as a key opportunity to catalyze action on developing green industrial hubs on the continent. Achieving these ambitious goals requires a comprehensive approach, one that integrates long-term strategic planning, supply and demand-side incentives, trade and investment facilitation, skills development, and infrastructure expansion. Today's webinar provides an opportunity to deep dive into South Africa's experience and lessons in building and enabling policy and institutional landscape for renewable energy manufacturing, explore investment opportunities, and discuss the role of regional and international cooperation to build competitive supply chains. It is great to see on the panel today representatives from the key ecosystem enablers, including leadership from the DTIC, Balancel, Granville Energy, Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa, National Association of Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers, Southern Transitions, and others. I am confident that these discussions will provide valuable insights for strengthening South Africa's renewable energy value chains and positioning the country as a regional and global hub for green industrialization. At SE4All, through the African Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative and the Council for Critical Minerals in the Global South, we are working closely with governments, industry, financing institutions, and development partners to develop green value chains for minerals to processing and refining to manufacturing. As South Africa leads the G20 process this year, there is a unique opportunity to place green industrialization at the center of global discussions and advance the Global South role in clean energy value chains. We are pleased to be working closely through the Energy Transition Working Group to deliver successful outcomes under the G20 presidency on the topic. I look forward on the outcomes of today's discussion and continued engagement as we work together to strengthen green value chains in Africa and the Global South. And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for your opening remarks. Mr. Yunus Hussain, the Acting Deputy Director General from DTIC, who was to join us today, has not been able to due to a last-minute commitment. But instead, I'm pleased to invite Ms. Annelies van der Merwe, the Director for Investment Promotion Green Economy from DTIC South Africa, to deliver the opening remarks, but also the scene-setting presentation. Annelies, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Devian, and good afternoon all. Thank you very much, Mr. Marguccio, for those opening remarks. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone here today. As Devian indicated, unfortunately, Mr. Hussain was not able to join us today, but has asked me to just deliver some remarks on his behalf. As Mr. Marguccio pointed out, with South Africa's green presidency of the G20, we really see an opportunity to put green industrialization and investment at the forefront of some of the G20 discussions, in particular, the discussions during the Trade and Investment Working Groups and the Trade and Investment Ministerial that will take place later in the year. We sincerely believe that value addition at source of minerals is critical for developing countries and countries of the Global South, in particular, looking at opportunities around low carbon manufacturing, and then the development of the value chains that can support global decarbonization and industrial adaptation. I'm going to launch straight into my presentation, if that's okay, Deviam. And I may just switch off my video for the duration of my presentation, as the network seems to be a bit patchy. If you can please confirm that you can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Excellent. Great. So the timing of this webinar is really opportune. Mention was made of the approval of the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan this morning by Cabinet. This has been a long time in the making, and was really the impetus that sparked a lot of the work that we have been doing in developing a value proposition for South Africa's clean technology manufacturing hub. This also reflects work that we have been doing with the World Bank Group and the International Finance Corporation since 2017, actually, but more particularly since October 2023, on helping to position South Africa as a location for investment in green technology value chains. So firstly, to go through some of the elements that I'll be discussing in the presentation, to talk about the South African market, why we see this opportunity for local manufacturing, the specific opportunity to produce some of the components locally, why South Africa and not other markets, and then the support that's available from the South African government and specifically InvestSA. So the South African energy landscape has changed dramatically over the last number of years. It is a diversifying electricity mix, still heavily reliant and dominant by coal, but this is rapidly changing. South Africa has one of the best solar irradiation resources in the world, but also extremely good wind resources that makes this an excellent location to develop renewable energy generation capacity. We have also seen that renewables has been increasing its share in South Africa's energy mix, with some of the figures indicating 17% share in 2023. We've also seen significant unmet demand. For those of you familiar with the South African environment, you may be familiar with our planned outages called load shedding. In South Africa, we had a number of days, almost 100 days without load shedding earlier in the year, but recently have again seen very constrained capacity. And this has also led to a large increase in the rollout of renewable energy generation capacity, especially behind the meter and self-generation capacity. In addition, there is also a lot of work happening behind the scenes to expand grid capacity, with about 14,000 kilometers of extra high voltage lines required by 2023 to ensure that we can capitalize on our renewable energy resources. We also see that the energy landscape has evolved, providing new opportunities for investment. Since 2021, when the electricity generation market was liberalized, we have seen over 10.5 gigawatts of projects registered with the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, with over 4 gigawatts registered in Q3 of 2024 alone. That's an increase of almost 3,000% over 2 years. Large majority of these projects are solar, and we saw 143 new projects registered in Q3 of 2024. So some of the projects that are already connected to the grid, contributing to the renewable energy generation capacity, battery energy storage, and large-scale solar PV rollout for private clients. Some of the deployments that we are predicting or forecasting until 2030 is about 10 gigawatts of rooftop solar, 22 gigawatts of large-scale wind and solar projects, procured mainly through the government's Renewable Energy IPP program, and then also a large requirement for battery energy storage. Currently, a very conservative estimate is a deployment of about 3 to 4 gigawatts per year, although that currently is closer to about 6 gigawatts of renewable capacity added per year until 2030. This is projected to grow further by 2040 as we implement very ambitious transition plans. We are also investing in adjacent markets that are further fueling demand for renewable energy renewable energy generation capacity. One of these adjacent sectors is new energy vehicles, with a specific focus on electric vehicles. And we have a very strong automotive sector that already invests in first, second, and third tier component manufacturing. And we believe that we have a real opportunity to also transition into the production of electric vehicles. Then further, we believe that South Africa can act as a gateway into renewable energy opportunities in adjacent markets in Africa, where there are also substantial growth forecasts up to 2030. Africa is home to 60% of the best solar resources globally, yet only 1% of the installed solar PV capacity to date. So we really see a great opportunity for growth on the continent as well. So just in summary, currently South Africa has the largest installed capacity of renewable energy, number one for both wind and solar in installed capacity in the sector. Now, why the manufacturing opportunity? The colleagues from Sustainable Energy for All mentioned the work that they've been doing on the African Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative, and this dovetails really nicely with the work that we have been doing to try to determine where South Africa should position itself in the clean technology manufacturing space, provided or based on some of the developments that we have seen in additional renewable energy generation capacity. So we've mentioned the Renewable Energy Master Plan, which was approved by Cabinet this morning, but also other policy documents have been released by the Industry Association, the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association in particular, but also did some work with the European Solar Association to look into the specific opportunity for developing the PV value chain in South Africa. Other institutions like the Presidential Climate Change Commission and the National Business Initiative have also recently conducted work on industrialization opportunities related to renewable energy manufacturing. So in SAREM, a lot of the work focused on mapping the clean technology manufacturing value chain for solar, wind, and energy storage, and then trying to understand where the opportunities lie for investment. This is based on massive import of renewable energy components over the last number of years, although that has flattened a little bit in 2024. Imports are still significant compared to previous years, and we really believe that this provides a solid basis for positioning South Africa as a manufacturing destination. So in order to support a lot of the work that we have been doing as government, we also wanted to get some independent views on where South Africa sits as compared to some of our peers and competitor markets for the production of these components. So through the support of the International Finance Corporation's advisory services, we commissioned IBM PLI, Plant Location International, to conduct a benchmarking study on South Africa's potential as a renewable energy manufacturing destination. The methodology employed by IBM PLI is twofold. They have a cost element looking mainly at input costs, labor costs, utility costs, transportation costs, duties, etc. They then also provide a 10-year profitability index, and then there is a qualitative element looking at elements such as general business environment, the regulatory environment, the market, size of the local market and adjacent markets, the availability of skilled labor, the existence of an ecosystem in that particular sector, and then infrastructure and connectivity, so access to and connectivity within the country. In the case of South Africa, we benchmarked some of the locations within the country, namely the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and Gauteng, but we also looked at 2 other African locations, Morocco and Kenya, and then a number of global players, China, India, Brazil, Germany, Poland, Turkey, and Vietnam. The results is then projected on sort of a 2x2 matrix, where the sweet spot is really in the top right-hand quadrant. For the purposes of our exercise, we removed China from the equation when we projected this on the 2x2 matrix, for the simple reason that it is most likely that companies that set up in South Africa will already have a manufacturing location in China and may be looking at setting up an additional manufacturing location. So for a number of components that we looked at, transformers and inverters, South Africa has a really compelling case for local manufacturing. This is the same for both solar PV module assembly and battery module pack assembly, where South Africa is again positioned in that sweet spot meaning that we have a great combination of a high quality destination at very competitive prices compared to some of our peers and competitors. I think this also then speaks to there is an existing ecosystem of companies producing components in South Africa across the entire renewable energy vertical, solar, wind, and battery energy storage. And this really supports the case for attracting additional investment in this sector. So South Africa, I think it was alluded to, is still one of the largest economies on the continent, one of the most developed economies in terms of our industrial capacity, the very good enabling business environment, competitive operating costs, very strong logistics hub, and a large and talented labor pool with competitive labor costs. We also believe that South Africa is well positioned as a springboard to the rest of the continent, especially given the work being done on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and free trade area, and the opportunities that this provides to companies wishing to locate here. Again, highly urbanized and young population with a very diverse talent pool and a very well-established and diversified manufacturing sector that currently employs about 1.2 million people. World-class infrastructure and logistics, both road, rail, and port facilities, as well as ICT infrastructure, and then also air access. And then we have a very strong team supporting companies when landing in South Africa. We provide support both to companies that already have a base here, but also to those that look to establish in the country for the first time. We do this through a regional network of subnational investment promotion agencies, as well as our special economic zones. So really, support is provided all along the investment journey, from creating awareness through fora such as these, but then also generating and sharing relevant and up-to-date information, providing specialized and tailored assistance to companies looking to locate here, and also then connecting potential investors with stakeholders, business organizations, and other service providers. And through the work that I mentioned earlier, we also play a very strong advocacy role, looking to improve South Africa's general business climate. I mentioned that we do this through a strong network of 9 provincial agencies, but also local government agencies located in some of our major cities, and then also the country's 11 special economic zones. And that is it. I hope I stuck to my time allocation, Pavel and Divyam. And I don't know if we will be taking questions now or if we will be going straight into the panel discussion, but happy either way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annelies. That was spot on to the second. I think that really provided us with a good overview of the opportunity that exists in South Africa, and thank you for laying that out very clearly. With the questions, what we will do is, attendees, please feel free to drop your question in the Q&A box at the bottom. We will then be directing them towards the end of the webinar to the different speakers, and we'll consolidate them. With that, I do want to hand over the floor now to our moderator for the afternoon and for the panel discussion, Gaylor Montmay-Sinclair, who's the director and co-founder of Southern Transitions, and who's also had a big role to play within the SAREM development process. So with that, Gaylor, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Divyam, and yeah, thank you as well for the invitation and the opportunity to moderate this panel. I think as everybody said already, this is a big week for SAREM. It's been a long journey for many of us. You know, I've personally lived and breathed SAREM for about 3 years now, and it is a big achievement for us to to be proud of, that we have managed to get SIAM approved by cabinet as official, framework and policy for South Africa. But of course, as we know, this is just the beginning of the road. We need to focus on implementation. We need to implement the close to 50 interventions that effectively have been identified through the SIAM process to try and curb and reverse the picture that we have been dealing with around imports. Over $11 billion of imports over the past 10 years of just three components, panels, inverters, and batteries. And again, these are just three components. So, there's many more components going into any renewable energy system. And, for that, we need to really hammer the interventions around the master plan to unlock as much demand as we can, build the skills that we need, drive industrialization through both supply and demand-side interventions, and of course, ensure an inclusive and transformed development of that value chain. And that requires huge efforts to do that, and a common effort from all across government, the private sector, labor, and civil society to really jointly drive action going forward. We set even targets, ambitious targets through the SIAM process to really indicate what is needed in terms of rollout to industrialize, and what that potentially means in terms of investment, industrialization, employment, transformation, and so forth. And so to speak and envision and unpack that implementation journey going forward, we're really fortunate to have a jam-packed, amazing panel with us of really practitioners and people on the ground and that are really living the industry, so that we can really just get to the nitty-gritties of what's really possible going forward, what is required, what are the next steps, and how do we foresee this journey over the next few years in South Africa as we build these industrial value chain, as we expand them, as we strengthen them. So I want to first turn to Andrew. Andrew McPherson is an investor and business advisor in Balancel, one of the companies that really manufactures local lithium and batteries in the country. And Andrew, I'd love to get your take on the potential for the industry going forward. There's a lot of discussions about the possibility or the ambition of South Africa, certainly, to grow an industry around batteries extensively, to integrate it around the different stages. Lots of talks around cell battery manufacturing, of course, leveraging of our critical minerals. And so in your perspective, what is really sort of the future of that industry over the next sort of, let's say, 5 years? Where do you see that going from your vantage point and your perspective?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I guess if I look at it from a perspective of Balancel, I guess we've probably been able to build a business and to survive because we picked a niche space, a kind of a very complicated part to get into. The focus of the business wasn't to build batteries, it was to understand batteries and build a technology on top of the battery and to make it better. From what I've seen from being involved in the space is that, unless there's a kind of support from the government in the space, I fear for the future of batteries in South Africa, because the real risk is the Chinese kind of competition. I don't think we're competing on a fair basis. I think there's heavy subsidization in the Chinese. We've just actually done a trip to China and spoken to some of the big businesses there, and it's very clear that there's a lot of subsidization going on. So I think, you know, if we're going to leave the gates open, it's going to be very difficult for South Africa to build a capability in that. Now, I know there's a lot of talk around, you know, building cells in South Africa. I think there is the capability to do that, but I mean, again, you're competing with China, who have spent the last probably 20 years building supply chains. You know, it's one thing saying we've got the minerals in the ground, but you can't take minerals out the ground and put it into a lithium cell and it's going to work. There's a whole beneficiation process that sits behind it. And I think China took the view 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years, maybe longer. So, you know, in terms of the internal combustion engine, Europe had stolen the march on that. Europe had put the supply chains in place. It was very difficult to compete with. So they took the view was, let's put the supply chains in place for electric. And they've done that. And it's going to be very difficult for South Africa to come along now and compete in that technology. But what I'm also saying is that technology is moving so quickly. You know, currently you're looking at sodium-ion batteries, you're looking at solid-state lithium batteries, you know, looking at hydrogen fuel cells. So I think, you know, China picked a technology, China picked LFP, and they were right in that choice. I think the big risk is if we go and try and now copy what they started 20 years ago, is by the time we've got to a space where we can pick it up, there's going to be some new technology. So we're going to be very careful that we're picking the right technology. We do, as I said, we do have the resources in the ground, but there's a whole supply chain and beneficiation that has to be built to make those minerals worth putting into a battery. So I think just to say we've got minerals in the ground, therefore we should be competitive is quite a naive approach. I think we need to understand what China are doing, and if we are serious about building a battery industry, creating jobs in this country, there has to be some support, you know, given from the government to that, either in the form of tariffs, even in the form of actually testing and regulations that are put in place, because there's nothing at the moment. You can import second-hand Chinese batteries into the country. Now, how can you compete with a second-hand battery? You know, it's very price competitive. So I think there is an opportunity, but I think there has to be a will at the end of the day, and it has to be a kind of tied up. It has to be a consolidated approach.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew. I think that's an important sort of reality check. Let's put it that way, on what's required. And I think we're all very much aware that you know, these opportunities are not going to materialize if action is not taken. And I guess that was, of course, the impetus, you know, behind Sareum. You pointed to the need for some support, the need for, I think, the ecosystem around standards, particularly, you know, around imports, mandatory standards, the ecosystem around testing and certification. We know the challenges around that in the battery industry, and really the need to have that sort of consolidated approach is really really important. I want to now turn to Kugan. Kugan Taylor, who's the head of machinery, equipment, and electronics at the Industrial Development Corporation, which is one of South Africa's leading development finance institutions. You've heard, you know, the plea or the call to action, let's say, from Andrew, and we know that, you know, we have a case to be made, and I think what Annelies presented is that, you know, South Africa is well positioned, but we also know that, you know, the global ecosystem is extremely competitive, and so in terms of what the IDC is looking at or has been doing, you know, to try and, I'd say, tip the balance a little bit more into South Africa's favor, you know, what has been your approach, or what is going to be your approach going forward in terms of saying, you know, okay, we want to support certain industry, we want certain players. How do we do that? How do we make the ecosystem, you know, a bit more competitive? We know it's so competitive that actually just a little bit can tip the balance in our favor. And so how do we do that? And what's the approach from IDC? Yeah.
Sure, great. Thank you very much, and hello to everyone on the call, on the webinar. I think if I can just reiterate Annelies's comments around the attractiveness of South Africa. I think we as the IDC play a part in that attractiveness. in terms that we are the financing arm of the state, and to obviously provide the industrial financing effectively. But we also operate across many aspects within the renewable chain. And I'll just outline some of them. I sit in the division that looks after manufacturing of renewable components. We do have an energy department that actually funds the IPP. We have an infrastructure department that will actually look at the infrastructure around the energy distribution, transmission, etc. So and on top of that, we have a projects division, which would look at early stage feasibility funding for various projects across the various industrial sectors, but specifically for the renewable sector, we could look at project feasibility funding. And I'll give you a typical example. I mean, the hydrogen sector is one of the areas we are looking at quite closely as to how we support that and get that type of sector up and running. And we're also looking at project feasibility funding in that. We are also open to project feasibility funding to establish new manufacturing entities here. Now, why I say that is because that shares the risk between parties who are willing to come and establish particular manufacturing concerns or renewable components. Yeah, we can share that risk. But I think if you look at the landscape, so the IDC has in the past funded various renewable component manufacturers, right? We will continue to do so, obviously taking into account the lessons learned, which is a very important fact in this particular sector as to what are the lessons learned within South Africa and the rest of Africa, and how do we, as you correctly said, not compete, but engage the rest of the world. And I think that we are positioned, I think, to be in South Africa and to look at the different type of partnerships that are offered. Obviously, South Africa and the rest of Africa, and we see the rest of Africa as being the bigger market. South Africa has a market. I mean, I think Gaylo, yourself, I think one of your LinkedIn quotes was we spent 6 billion on solar panels last year. And if that continues, and Annalisa said there's about 10 gigawatt of rooftop, the market for rooftop solar manufacturing is immense. How do we now position a foreign manufacturer to come here? We will share the risk with them to actually look at how we tap into that market. So there's a number of things we can do to support that. Number one is we can share the risk with the foreign OEM or even local OEM, because there's a lot of local companies who are also going into the space, specifically along the battery assembly side, solar PV side. The wind sector is a bit subdued at the moment, I think, for obvious reasons. But I think on the other areas, we can share the risk, we can share the project risk, we can also share the actual funding into the rest of Africa. Now, that is a very important part because, as you know, a lot of these other countries bring their funding with, right? They'll bring the panels, they'll bring the state-owned sort of export finance in. And what we are looking at right now is how do we engage with the rest of Africa on a shared basis? Because I don't think you can go into the other African countries and just say you want to import South African, content. You have to have a shared model with them to see how they benefit, even in the value chain. So I think our positioning is to say we are willing to partner with foreign OEMs and local OEMs, but we're also looking at how do we establish the value chains between ourselves and the rest of Africa, and what type of funding mechanisms are going to be put in place. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much. I think that's very, I would say, realistic in terms of the approach. I think I like the thinking around certainly project feasibility funding. I think that's critical, and we need that a lot more. I think a lot of risk sharing effectively is really important, so that we kind of go at it together. And I think that's true between countries, but also between public sector, private sector, and thinking about it effectively in terms of a partnership. For me, that is really important. And so if we look at partnerships, we look at value chains as well. We look at different sectors. And so Beth, I want to turn to you now. So Beth Delpy is the head of policy and regulatory affairs at NACAM. That's the National Associations for Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers in South Africa. And of course, the renewable energy industry, the automotive industry are interrelated in so many ways. At the center of that is the discussion around batteries and how we can transition our existing manufacturing entities into the e-mobility world. Ford, for instance, I know has just announced that they've started to export now some plug-in hybrids made in South Africa, and others are starting to tap into this at the OEM level. We also know that, of course, at the component level, it's a very vibrant ecosystem of companies that are also playing in that space. And so, what do you think is the future for OEM in terms of components, but also other manufacturers in the component side as we transition? What's the ecosystem in South Africa, and can it leverage effectively the transition going forward? Where are the areas where maybe we need to do a bit more to make sure that actually we have a future? What's the landscape from your perspective?
Perfect. Thanks, Gaylor. Yeah, I think the component sector is a really important part of a transition. We're always very clear that from a value addition for the economy and from a job creation perspective, and with that, obviously, your skills and tech transfers, that ultimately comes from a component sector. And so as an automotive industry moving into NEV production, be it hybrid, plug-in, BEV, or fuel cell even, whatever the case may be, your contribution to the economy and really the value that sector will generate only comes if we're localizing key components with it. And there's a few different ways to really look at that. One is the positive, I suppose, in the situation is from a pure quantum of domestic sales that we do in the sector. A lot of that is technology agnostic components. So I always use the example, a seat is a seat. Whatever car it finds itself in, it'll still have an application. And that obviously we're already competitive at. We're already producing it for global OEMs, and that should continue to be supported and sustained as we currently are. The downside of this one is from an export perspective, obviously at the moment we are exceptionally catalytic converter heavy. And that's obviously a declining technology or legacy technology in a battery electric platform. And so we as a sector need to seriously consider, well, what are we doing to replace that? How are we pivoting the industry? And so that takes a whole one kind of side of policy incentives and what more should be done. And I'll touch on that in a sec. And then the third instance is, great, we have some technologies that will continue to be utilized and we should be continuing to support those. Yes, we need to pivot those who are currently producing catalytic converters and other legacy technologies. And luckily, they're often multinationals that do have a global tech in clean mobility. It's about how do we attract that investment to pivot in South Africa. And then your third kind of arm to it, if we can call it that, is, well, what other opportunities may arise in this NEV transition? And there has been a lot of research into exactly which components we believe we have the capabilities to localize, primarily based on, one, the availability of raw materials in South Africa or SADC. Correctly, as Andrew says, though, having the minerals and the raw materials is one thing, but how do we beneficiate it and really get maximum value from it? And that's certainly something we need to probably look at greater levels of incentivization, maybe within our own automotive policy program, greater levels of recognition for raw materials to try and boost domestic demand and boost the beneficiation industry. And then beyond that, I think there's a lot to be said about, generally speaking, incentivizing technology investment, production investments in the component side of the sector. We've already got a 35% AIS. That was an increase from 25% under your internal combustion engine vehicles. So that should go some way in driving that transition. Obviously, the other key driver is OEM demand. And whilst we can be obviously producing for the export market, and export promotion forms part of that, we do need our domestic OEMs to ultimately pull the trigger and move in that direction. But from an incentivization perspective, it's starting to come up. I do believe there is more to be done from a raw material competitiveness. AMSA actually lends some interesting lessons for us on what we should be or could have been doing to support raw material inputs more successfully so. And then I think to Andrew's point as well here is the more enabling ecosystem. I mean, we can talk about incentives and more should be done there, but I think there is also just an overarching enabling ecosystem that would benefit component manufacturing, OEM manufacturing, renewable energy industry, and that goes down to ultimately to our logistics system in South Africa and energy. And specifically when I say energy, I know the focus has been on getting stable energy out of Eskom for quite some time, but we need to start moving that towards renewable energy. It's one thing to be talking about a carbon neutral vehicle, but what about the supply chain emissions? And that's the kind of part of the equation that's often forgotten and would be an important element in moving us forward. So I do think there's opportunities. I think South Africa, if we play our cards right, we're decisive in how we approach it, we're proactive in how we approach it, there's opportunities. Certainly, I think also to Andrew's point, the market protection needs to be something we need to seriously consider. China particularly has a huge amount of excess capacity in a lot of these key NEV technologies, and that will always make it pretty challenging to develop a domestic industry. But yeah, opportunities exist. Certainly there is, I think, more to be done, but also we're at a relatively early stage of that transition. I mean, the white paper came out, I suppose, a year ago or so, and the policies are currently being implemented. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks, Beth. I think for starting to flesh out, I would say the more complex picture. Often, I think it is looked at it from one particular vantage point, and it's not really kind of capturing the diversity of companies, the complexity of the interactions. It's not just about one technology or one part or one component. There's a more complete ecosystem of companies, and I think we need to leverage that. I want to remind everyone to please shoot your questions if you have any into the Q&A. We'll take those in just a moment. Before we carry on, I see Andrew, you got your hand up, and maybe you want to react or add some complementary to one of the points. So yeah.
Sorry, thanks. Sorry, it was a point that Coogan made, and maybe I didn't stress this enough, but you know, it's this consolidated view across industry. So the Coogan point made the point that, you know, the IDC provide funding, and they do. I mean, the IDC gave us some funding at the start, which helped us. But the IDC, we're talking about the IPP project. So now the IDC provide funding, but now and you got the IPP office. So now I'm trying not to raise names here, but you know, we've been speaking to one of the big EPCs who won one of the IPP tenders. They were very excited to use a local battery supplier for a small portion of that project, just to prove that we could do it. You know, the IPP had a rule, and the IPP office had a rule that the equipment supplier, it was a 620 megawatt hour battery. The equipment supplier had to have previously installed 620 megawatt hours of battery in a project. Okay, so that basically gongs out everyone except for China. There's no one who's going to compete with that. So you know, and then you go back to the thing. So China has got, I think it's 500 to 800 gigawatts of installed BESS in their country. I will take a bet with anyone that they do not have 1 kilowatt hour of anything but Chinese BESS in that 800 gigawatt hours of BESS in their country. So we have now gone down the road. I think we've approved 2.5 gigawatt hours of BESS. I guarantee that we do not have 1 kilowatt hour of anything produced in South Africa in the BESS system. So where's the problem? You know, and so IDC are saying they will provide funding, you know, for us to provide components of that, not the whole thing. If you were just to say, of the 2.4 gigawatt hours or whatever it is, take 10%, give it to South African battery producers. That's enough to start scaling this industry. But without scale, you will never compete, because, I mean, I'll give you an example of just the numbers. Is if we went to the cell supplier at the moment and said we want to order 50 megawatt hours of cells, the price of that is 25% lower than the current cost of those cells. So without scale, you can't compete. But you know, just having this consolidated view and saying, okay, well, let's take 10%, let's take 20% of the IPP, and push South African battery assemblers, battery producers into that space. That's enough to scale this industry to help them, you know, protect or fight against the Chinese imports. So that was just the view I wanted to make on this consolidated, because you can't have the IDC working in one direction, the IPP office working in another direction, you know, the DTI working in another direction. There has to be people sitting around a table and saying, we're actually all working together here, because at the moment, that's not happening like that. The IDC are scared to speak to the IPP office because there's a conflict. The DTI are scared to speak to the IPP because there's conflict. There's conflicts all over the place, instead of saying, let's actually sit together as one consolidated view. Thanks. Sorry, that was my point.
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrew. I think you pointed out to the coherence of the efforts, and I think that is something that is tremendously important. That you know, as we promote the rollout of renewable energy and battery storage technologies, we support the local manufacturing, and I think often that is a point that, you know, there's a tension and you're always going to have those arguments. Some say we should be rolling out of renewable energy, and that's the goal, and it doesn't matter where it comes from. That we should be pushing for it. Others say, well, I hear you, but let's build industries. And of course, that's what Saram is trying to do, to acknowledge the fact that there is a big potential to build those industries, align public procurement, incentivize the private procurement for local manufacturing. But we know where we are as well, and we know the past. We know the journey that we've been on, and some of the mistakes that we've made. So I think that's really important that we take stock of that, and I think we take your point quite to heart now. I want to turn to Tabby now, for a bit of a different take. Tabby is the founder and CEO of Granville Energy. And so you're operating in the space, of renewable energy industry, trying to really kind of develop the industry from the ground up, from a South African perspective. And again, you've heard, I think, Annalise picture in terms of what's possible, the landscape. What's your take on the ground in terms of what's really possible in terms of local manufacturing, particularly I know in the solar industry, in terms of where do you think we should focus on, and what is required to get there?
Okay, thanks, Gaylor. And I'd like to first of all appreciate the data that Annalise presented. I think it came in quite handy. And I wish I had that last week when I was in Addis at the AU, because of some really juicy data that we could have used. And also Andrew's point he made. Now, from a solar PV perspective, we have been very involved in the rooftop solar space, as well as CNI space. And the decision we made, from the beginning to get involved in the value chain was not just to improve our profitability, but also we had a view that we had to secure the supply chain for Africa and for South Africa. We had a bit of knowledge of what happened out of the country in other markets, where at certain time of the year, the local manufacturers will be shut down, there will be restriction on export of certain components to support local industry. And that way, they then get support to build the kind of capacity they will need to go out and compete, exactly what Andrew was talking about. So when there's an RFP in international market, they would have they'll meet the requisite capacity and history to be able to compete. So for us as South Africa, we do have, based on the stats that Annalise presented, we have 10 gig of rooftop solar. That is a huge opportunity. The opportunity is not just for installers, but also for manufacturing. If you look at how much money we export in terms of balance of payment, 6 billion is a lot of money in dollars to export. It can make a huge difference to the economy. Now, if we go to, let's use China, Shenzhen, for instance, because all of us in this space work with Shenzhen as mostly capital city for components that we use. It would take me a month to build a new product from start to finish, because I can find the value chain in a single street. And in South Africa, we don't have that. As much as we're looking at the global competitiveness, we have to start somewhere. If we have to build and meet up the capacity we need by 2030, if we have to consider a mission 300 across the continent, we shouldn't be looking at South Africa alone. South Africa is part of the continent, and there is a big demand across the continent for supply chain. We miss out on those opportunities. We need to start somewhere, and I think with rooftop, with CNI, and especially with the IPP projects, is a good opportunity. And for me, I want to amplify Andrew's point he made, that without the support of local supply chain, we don't have any future, right? There is a need for consolidation of effort, of strategy, and of views between the funders, especially from a development finance perspective, what IDC is doing, with DBSA, with DTIC. We need to come together and have a considered effort to determine how much of the total spend of the country will go towards supporting local industries. Now, let's imagine we hit another COVID or another pandemic 2 years from now. Where do we stand? Right? But what we're missing out on is not just the PV sector. The automotive industry will suffer. Our business is involved in the entire value chain, from PV module manufacturing, battery, not battery cells here, but battery modules, inverters, and obviously charging station. But if we don't have the supply chain locally, how does that affect our ability to transition on time and in a manner that is affordable for the end consumer? So from my perspective, there's a huge opportunity in the manufacturing space. The knowledge that we gain in manufacturing one component or one specific product can be transferred to a different industry. So Beth spoke about a seed is a seed. I like that because the concept in Germany of little giants started somewhere, and China is doing exactly the same thing as part of the industrialization policy. So how do we create little giants? If you go to Rosslyn in Pretoria, or you go to Silverton around Ford, we have small companies going through programs to support them to develop skills and expertise to support the local industry. They need to start somewhere. If we say that, well, South Africa is not a competitive market, globally speaking, when it comes to automotive industry, then we're never going to have that. So we need to look at the entire value chain beyond the specific industry and look at adjacent industries that can benefit, from the expertise that we develop through local manufacturing and obviously cross-border collaboration. We have intra-Africa free trade. How do we bring that into the equation so that we can expand manufacturing benefit from South Africa to include our neighboring countries like Zimbabwe and Namibia, where we have raw materials we can use? But how do we beneficiate those raw materials when we don't have a market to have a leverage, buyout or to leverage the capacity I have in the country? So it's a chicken and egg situation. I think we need to have a bridge, have a conversation between the entrepreneurs who are willing to take the risk, like some of us are doing right now, and those who are mandated to fund the development of these industries. And let's look at the society. In our business, we involve the community. I go to the township myself. I spend time in the township to understand the need. And I bring my engineering team and research team from China. We work together. They're actually here right now. So when we develop products, we don't just develop in a vacuum. We also do the same with bankers. I was in Ethiopia last week where we had a good time with AFDB and Afrexim Bank. We had very, very candid conversation around what we need to do as a continent. And I think we need to do the same in South Africa, because without that combined knowledge, we have views that are specific to our jobs. So if I'm a banker, I look at things from a banking perspective, and the entrepreneur is frustrated because we don't speak the same language. So I would like to support Andrew's view that we need to have some kind of consolidation, and it's about time we come together to see how we can support manufacturing sector in South Africa.
Great, thanks so much, Debbie. I think you make some really relevant point. I really like your point around the importance of adjacent industries, and I think the need to kind of start crowding things in effectively, and how you develop your capabilities over time is quite instrumental. There are quite a lot of companies in the country that I know that have tried to do that, and some of them with great success, actually used to service the rail industry, the mining industry, it doesn't matter, and I've managed to pivot somewhat to now produce renewable energy parts and components, not exclusively for the renewable energy industry, but adding that to their arsenal, adding that to their product range. And that's really what we want to see. We want to see, better, bigger industries going forward. And so I think that's really, really important. One point that you mentioned really is kind of the region, the continental approach, I'd say. And so maybe to delve into that, I want to turn to Ants. Ants Ventor was the strategy and innovation manager at Rome. So in a slightly different industry than you, Tavi, of course, more on the mobility side. But you've taken a regional continental approach from the get-go, really, in terms of your thinking. And I think it's really quite interesting to hear from you, your perspective on why that matters. How do we bring that together? We often hear a lot about regional cooperation, regional integration, and it almost feels a bit like wishful thinking in some ways. But there are some real opportunities to leverage on the ground and to make that happen very concretely. And so very interesting in your take and how you've been navigating that space and where you think the opportunities lie.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I started as an investor in Rome. 4 years ago, and I fell in love with the mission. I think the EV manufacturing opportunity is a once in a generation opportunity for sub-Saharan Africa. There's a $3 trillion industry being redefined, and we see supply chains shifting. And because of that, I joined Rome a year and a half ago. And I've never seen an opportunity where it hits the social, climate, and economic impact in such a synergy. But like you said, is it wishful thinking? I think we need to balance a little bit between that realism and the dream. Because if we can dream it, we can do it. But today, we also need to target a realistic dream as countries and as regions. And I think China and India over the past 10, 20 years shown that good industrial policy can, by design, have this huge impact. Individual clusters, but also the clusters combined in China, what they're achieving today across robotics, PCBs, electric motors. There's regions that are selected, and then within a 30, 50 kilometer radius, you can get anything you need for that specific component or component group. If we look at BYD, I think it was mentioned by Andrew earlier, is BYD hired 220,000 people in the third quarter of last year. Yeah, that just baffles me. I don't know how you even go about that. And they have a 32,000 acre campus being built. That's the land area of Amsterdam. If I look at people wanting to live on a campus like that, China and for a part India, they can by design push that. So I think my question is, South Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, what is a realistic path? What do we actually bet on? We see that the climate urgency demands our transport to be clean, and our economic situation requires it to be affordable. And electric can be both, but electric today isn't designed for Africa. So what Rome has spent the last 7 years on is designing motorcycles and buses for the region. And what Beth said, wholly agree. A seat is a seat. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We take what is commoditized and we try to look at what is not commoditized and differentiate on that. So if we're able to attract part of that EV supply chain here, we can partially leverage our current supply chains, and South Africa is uniquely positioned for that. I don't think there's an automotive sector that is as advanced as is the one in South Africa. So when we looked at our go-to-market for South Africa, it was also relatively easy to find really good technology partners. I think the financing partners were not really following through, especially on the government side. So we had big commitments, but they didn't follow through. So I think that's one of the things that is a blocker. I think the opportunity needs to be realized. It needs to be realistic and then acted on. If we look at China, they act in days. European investors act in years. And I think we need to be maybe somewhere in the middle. But we do need to act fast and with a coherent plan. I think it was mentioned before as well that needs to cut across. The fragmentation of the market was mentioned. I think we need a relatively high performance and high affordability in the region. As an engineer, that's an exciting challenge, but that needs economies of scale. We drove 2 of our motorbikes from Nairobi to Stellenbosch as a stunt, but it was because of our bikes. If we wanted to ship them from Mombasa to Durban, they went through Singapore or India. So we need to fix how we harmonize policies and logistics across our markets. And AFCTA is, at the moment, this hopeful bucket. I'm not sure if it will be that in practice, but we need to harmonize the policies and the logistics. And I think what we see is that with the US and Europe bringing in tariffs, China is pushing hard to deploy products here on the continent. And unfortunately, governments and institutions are not always able to protect. So we see a lot of regions that are succumbing to import, and also low value assembly that's being said to be manufacturing and creating jobs, but in practice, SKDs, semi-knockdown kits don't actually add a lot of value. So I think the opportunity is there. We have a very big local market. We have a really good labor force. We have a geographic and geopolitical position that can leverage both our regional markets and our intercontinental markets. And we have critical minerals. And I think, especially here in East Africa, the Rift Valley But I think across the region, we have renewable energy sources. It's geothermal or hydro or solar. So you also have that opportunity to leverage that into low carbon manufacturing. So very exciting opportunity, but definitely needed to align on the path. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hans. I think that's you know, again, I think a lot of food for thoughts. You know, I think that clustering is quite fundamental, and again, I think that speaks to kind of growing in industries, making sure that everything is available, that infrastructure is there, that the you know the competencies are there, the skills are there, the components, and of course the market, but also getting our ducks in a row. You know, I think I won't put our government counterpart on the spot, but you know, I'm sure they'll follow up with you after the webinar on what happened there. But we do need to make sure that we support, you know, those that are willing to invest and do that timely, because it is a market that is moving very fast, you know, and the world is not waiting on us to do that. Just yeah, one more reminder to add your questions to the Q&A if you have any. Thanks for those that have already done that, and we'll pick up on those in just a moment. Before we do that, I want to come back to Annelies. You know, following from obviously your initial presentation and everything that you've heard. An angle that hasn't been touched on yet is more on the multilateral and the global landscape. We know that, you know, this year is important for South Africa and for Africa through the G20. You know, one of the key areas of the South African presidency is to drive green industrialization through the G20. It is one of the commitments, or one of the goals at least. How do you think the G20 can realistically be leveraged to do that and to support green industrialization in South Africa, but of course G20 being G20 beyond this as well?
Thanks, Kado. Yes, I mean, I think, you know, as you mentioned, one of the key areas that we want to push, specifically through the Trade and Investment Working Group, but also more generally, is this issue of green industrialization, but also the issue of reforms in the global trade rules that will allow South Africa and other countries from the global south to build competitive renewable energy industries. I mean, you know, everything from local content policies, subsidy rules, intellectual property regulations, tariff structures, climate-related trade measures. Without these measures and these changes rather to the global trade rules, the risk remains that the green transition will reinforce global inequality rather than bridge global inequality. So I think, you know, one of the things that we want to focus on is sort of this flexibility in trade policies that can help also protect some of our nascent industries. I think from the green industrialization point of view, you know, for us, it's also this focus on this sort of grand bargain that promotes value addition. I mentioned that right in the beginning, value addition of critical minerals close to the source of, and the development of then global or low carbon manufacturing value chains. It's also important that we look at some other principles, the issue of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities in the transition. We see that global supply chains are currently under stress due to geopolitical friction and then a rise in protectionism. We've seen quite dramatic examples of that in recent weeks, but including green protectionism. And I think something, you know, like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, which will impact on countries in the global south significantly as compared to companies in the global, or countries and companies in the global north. And I think you know, we would like to see G20 members to commit to overcoming global economic fragmentation and strengthening global supply chains. I mean, this is no small feat, considering that we need to hand over the presidency back to the US. So it's the G20 has now come full circle, with South Africa as the last president in this current cycle, and then handing back over to the US. So that in itself will be an interesting exercise. But I think you know, green industrialization really presents a unique opportunity to promote diversification of supply chains, of value chains, and that can contribute to ensuring that, you know, if we look at something like mineral beneficiation, for example, that this is done equitably through value addition, and that we do that through shared prosperity. And really integrate it in a much more meaningful way than what happened in the past. So yes, you know, that's really some of the core elements that we would like to include on this G20 framework on inclusive green industrialization, and really this focus on the word inclusive, and looking at the mutual benefits for everyone in the trading system.
Great. No, thanks so much, Annelies. I think that's yeah, it's a tall order. We know it's a challenge, but I think we have to aim big if we want to affect some change. Before we turn to some of the questions, I see Hans wants to say a few words to come back. So yeah, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. I think this point segues greatly into something I wanted to mention. So we engaged a lot with the previous administration in the US, and it was on critical minerals development. And we saw that the US is developing the Lobito corridor to the west to try and get the minerals out to the US. We see that China is developing a similar pathway to the east. And our question was, how can we keep those minerals here and process them here? And I think the key is to realize that we can't all make batteries. And it links a little bit to what was said by Andrew and some of the others, is that we can't all make batteries. We should pick and choose. But my question, I think, for this audience and for the group is, how do we then decide where we make what, and who can take that leadership? And is the G20 the platform to discuss those things? I think that's one of the questions that we grapple with.
Yeah, thanks, Anton. I think that's an important point. I think that actually segues nicely into one of the questions. You know, and Andrew, I see you got your hand up, and the question was for you anyway, so you can maybe kind of feed a little bit of an answer into your broader point that you're going to make. But you know, the question that we got was kind of, what's the main difference really between, you know, effectively EV battery manufacturing in Africa and in China? You know, so what's the sort of key determinant that makes it really really different? You know, I think, you know, in the question really there's a reference to minerals, and I think that speaks to Ernst's points. You know, yes, minerals are a factor, but as you pointed out earlier, you know, it's not the answer to the equation. You know, it's really a factor. And so I think to Ernst's point, you know, like, we can't all make batteries. Certainly not every country can make their own batteries, you know, on the African continent. And so, you know, what's the sort of competitive edge that we're looking at, certainly from a South African perspective, but then even more broadly, I think, on the continent? You know, what's the homework that we need to do, and how do we get to those answers?
Yeah, so it's actually, it was what I wanted to actually speak about was, so I 100% agree with you, is that not everyone can make batteries, and you know, and what I alluded to just now is, you know, China's been on this process for probably 20 years, building these supply chains, you know, but China have backed the technology. They backed lithium ferrophosphate cells, and it was proven to be the right technology at this time, and it's what's dominating the market at the moment. You know, but there are a number of other technologies which are coming to the fore. So as I said, there's the sodium, there's the you know, solid state lithium cells, there's you know, hydrogen, And as I understand it, India has taken a view that hydrogen is the next technology, and they're going hard after hydrogen fuel cells. South Africa has to potentially pick a lane for the future technology as well. What China has got now is they've got a massive sunk cost. They've got a sunk cost in their lithium ferrophosphate production. That's going to keep them stuck in that technology for a few years. That gives you the opportunity to maybe look for a new technology and build the supply chains to support that newer technology. Obviously, you've got to pick the right technology, and I think that's the key question. But in terms of where South Africa can play a part is, the way I see it is that these geopolitical tensions that are kind of coming to the fore can present an opportunity for South Africa. And what I mean by that is the Chinese have stolen the march in the lithium ferrophosphate space, but they are subsidizing these batteries into the market, and then they're not doing that for free. There's if you can outcompete every other battery manufacturer in the world, in 5 years' time or 6 years' time, you're not a price taker anymore, you're a price setter. And I think that's one of the strategies that's been followed here. And I think European markets are very aware of that, and they're looking for alternatives. Now, South Africa has got and interestingly enough, if you look at Europe, you've got a number of potential battery manufacturers in Europe who have raised significant amounts of capital and who have failed. I mean, the most recent one is Northvolt, who raised close to 15 billion euros. There was Zerotech in Ireland that raised 65 million euros and have just gone bankrupt. So there are a number of these kind of startup battery manufacturers in Europe that have started and have failed. And whereas in South Africa, you've actually got 4 or 5 of these battery manufacturers who actually haven't raised close to that amount of capital and are actually, kind of being able to survive. So that kind of says to you, well, maybe there's a possibility for South Africa to provide an alternative to Europe, because Europe do not want to be reliant. They realize the risk of being reliant on one kind of battery supplier. So potentially there's an opportunity for South Africa, navigating these geopolitical tensions, to actually put their hand up and say, we actually can be an alternative supplier. Look, you always got reliance on the cells, and we need to look at their technologies. Can we produce cells? But there are a number of potential cell manufacturers popping up in the world. They are Chinese, but it does diversify your geopolitical risk, and I think that's potentially a risk. But then also, there's batteries and there's batteries and there's batteries. Now, if your traditional storage battery is not going to work in an EV, and it's definitely not going to work in a forklift, and it's not going to work in mining equipment, and it's not going to work in some of the tougher applications. Now, we can go after the EV market, which China is going, because that's a massive space. Or you can actually pick niches. You can pick industrial equipment, which is a massive industry in the world. You go look at the size of the industrial equipment market around the world. It's massive. Now, you could make a play for that, and you can build supply chains, and you can specialize in special battery applications. Mining equipment is another one. We've definitely got the capability to produce specialized mining batteries and lead the market in that. So I think competing flat out against China would be a mistake, but I think you can pick your battles and you can find a niche for yourself in that space.
Yeah. No, yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I think it's a nice segue actually to the next question. And maybe Tavi, I see you got your hand up, so you can take that one and also kind of add what you wanted to add. But in terms of, we can't compete and on, like with China. I mean, we know it's, Europe is struggling to do that. The US is struggling to do that. I mean, we're not going to be able to do this, but we have to find our niche. We have to find our opportunity, and we have to look at it from a regional or continental fashion. But again, easier said than done. How do we look at it from a regional perspective? How do we build value chains effectively, regional value chains, continental value chains, regionally or continentally, to really bring those trends together and really be able to compete in the market, in some ways.
Kayla, I think that's a very important point. From the Granville perspective, we had taken a position that we will not be in this business to respond to competition. That's not why we're here. I did not develop the industrialization policy of any country, so I don't know what the leaders were thinking, or the business leaders and political leaders. But what I know for certain, I do know this continent. I know the challenges we face, I know our problems, and I know we have the solution. So that's the perspective of an entrepreneur, and I know where to get a solution from. So if we look at Africa, for instance, if you take Gabon and you do a 2-hour, flight radius from Gabon, you basically will hit about 500 million people on the continent. That is a big market. And most of these people do not have electricity, they do not have good roads, they don't have water. So our need is huge. Now, if we look at the European market, battery might not be such a big deal for them because they have a very stable grid. The challenge they have is very different from ours. The cost of electricity varies in winter and summertime. So if we focus on the African continent, the African problem, in my view, we have a sizable market, that we can address. So our addressable market is big, and we should not just look at the South African market alone. Let's look at the African market in totality. That is where I see us combining efforts. So my company can work with Andrew's company, where we can put our heads together and say, well, you manufacture battery cells. Where do we need in the market where we play, for instance? And there might be cases where we might need to build solar power plants. We need to support local manufacturers. For instance, the rules that are set for the game were not set by us, right? I mean, there was a project in the DRC that was funded by IFC. It was about finally $65 billion. Not one company in Africa benefited from that deal. We pulled out of it because it was pointless. So this project come onto the continent. We hear that a lot of money came in. We don't hear how much of it stayed and how much actually went out. In most cases, 99% of it will flow out. So how do we support ourselves? By looking at the business context from a regional or from a continental perspective. It is big enough. So if we look at 300 million people under Mission 300, it is a sizable market to bring transformation to companies in South Africa, in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, in Gabon, all over the continent. We as entrepreneurs need to start working together. We need to obviously collaborate with continental bodies. For instance, AMDC, the African Mineral Development Center of the AU, which I do participate in. We need to drive policy changes from that level. But also we need to lobby as entrepreneurs with institutions who provide the funding, right? While I do agree with Kugan about supporting, organizations to come in and build local industries, the truth is, I speak as somebody who does business across the world. I will not get the same support if I go to the United States, if I go to China to support my company to come in. It is local companies first. That's what's been the policy. So if we have any project that has national implication, national impact, there's nothing wrong in saying that, we need to support South African manufacturers first. The standards are not set by Chief in Germany or set by some company in China or in the US. It's set by SABS. Let's go with our own standards. Who created those standards? We do have professors at the universities here. If I go to Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, and I want to benefit from the research they do, they told me straight, no, we will not share the research with you anymore unless you are an EU company or you have to register in Germany, right? So let's solve one problem. I mean, we have been building technology in South Africa, military technology with Denel, so many companies, the expertise is here. I know companies in Nigeria right now who are building drones, military-grade drones that can fly for 120 kilometers and do amazing things. We don't know about them. So I don't think it's a question of market or opportunity. I don't think it's a question of funding. I think it's a question of reviewing how we work and how we view the continent and how we can leverage the challenges we have as opportunities and how money can flow in to those points to support those who are willing to take the risk, some of those problems. By doing that, what we've done is we've created a platform for future generations. So if we talk about advancement in battery technology, we have a lot of sodium option on the continent, right? But what about vanadium flow battery? It might not be applicable for EV, but it might be applicable for other sectors. What about small modular reactors, right? So what are we missing out? If we cannot start by supporting local manufacturing, we've actually forfeited our future opportunities to be able to participate in the global economy. So in my view is, let's see how we can leverage the supply chain we have for the continent, no matter how small, have a forum where we can have concerted effort to share ideas and see how we can benefit from each other and build. We have to start somewhere. And by doing that, we stop the outflow of funds. If we talk about negative balance of payment, what do we need to do to stop that negative balance of payment?
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Terry. Thank you. Thank you for those points. We are drawing to the end of the webinar, but we still have a few minutes, so we will use them. Beth, I want to kind of turn to you briefly. A lot of talks about battery and battery manufacturing, and we know that there's no way around it. If we want to sustain automotive manufacturing in South Africa, battery manufacturing going forward is non-negotiable. It's gonna have to play some role. Where are the discussions, or what's the sort of landscape at the moment around the future of that value chain around the batteries for automotive applications? What's happening at the moment? Are we getting to a point it's looking likely to happen?
Look, I think, and there's a stepped approach. I don't think per se the cell conversation has really advanced significantly so at this point in time. Correctly speaking, I mean, one of the speakers was talking about the kind of European need to diversify. That to some extent has been driving the cell conversation, with them approaching the South African industry to say, well, what would be possible from an African and South African perspective. Where there's probably a bit more progression is more on the battery pack module management system, that side of the industry, largely because there's already a degree of existing capabilities. We already have members who are producing the enclosure and exporting that. There's companies in South Africa that are capable of the kind of battery pack assembly. But again, it kind of does hinge, at least on an assembly level, it hinges on an OEM moving into at least sourcing that from South Africa, moving in ultimately to battery manufacturing. It is a key conversation because ultimately, and I think it was mentioned at the start, is the rules of origin, and particularly for our exports into Europe, with a 60% rule of origin, it becomes a critical element to localize beyond our own master plan targets if we want to still be getting preferential access into our biggest export market. We need to be meeting those rules of origin, and batteries are fundamental to that, given their innate value. That being said, I do still think that they're relatively high level conversations. But as much as I say that, I'm also not wanting to necessarily be overly harsh, in the sense of, I think it was always recognized from a progression perspective, we were never going to overnight suddenly have a solution to be producing battery cells in the country. I think it's always been understood that, look, we need to start off with the assembly side of things and supporting the kind of ancillary battery components. And that, in theory, increased AIS should be supporting. Then I think the medium-term strategy was your beneficiation, which I think is probably a bit harder than maybe initially anticipated. And then finally your cells. So it was always anticipated that it would take a longer period, but I do think it is still generally at a high level kind of discussion, and more is probably directly needed to support EV battery manufacturing. And going beyond, at the moment, the focus is kind of on, okay, well, do we reduce duties on EV batteries to enable OEMs to pivot into battery electric vehicle manufacturing? We're going to have to move swiftly away from that conversation if we ever want to build any level of domestic industry. That might be your 1 to 2 year approach to kind of catalyze EV manufacturing, but it's certainly not a long-term developmental approach.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. I think that helps a lot, kind of with the situational analysis in terms of where we are and where we can go going forward. Kugan, I want to close with you in terms of this part of the program. We've heard a lot about the need for alignment between different elements of policy, different parts of government, different parts of private sector that need to align. And I know, look, it's not the role of IDC to do that. No single institution can do that. But maybe just from your take, how do you look at the market from that perspective, from an IDC perspective, and say, well, okay, we are trying to build the value chains around these different elements, and we're trying to align these different pieces where we can, as a DFI. What's your take on that? How we can kind of improve and what we're doing going forward?
Sure. So I think we need to decide as a country and a continent, where do we want to participate within these value chains? I mean, China at the moment has got the monopoly around all the renewable components. Europe, as Andrew said, and the story about Northvolt, they sort of withdrawing. They've invested. It hasn't been successful. So we need to decide: do we have products that are niche, which are world class, which then we need to back, and push out in the rest of the world? Or do we need to become part of the value chain and decide where do we play in that value chain? Which component? And then we bring in the foreign OEMs, local OEMs to actually support that. So, because I can tell you one thing, we can't do everything. As much as we'd like to, it's not possible. Partnerships, engagements within the rest of Africa and other OEMs. So we need to decide that, I think, specifically. And then we become part of the value chain. And we've got a lot of critical minerals, I think, in South Africa and the rest of Africa. How do we leverage that to attract the foreign OEMs to come and say, we've got this part of the value chain, can you come in and how do we build into your value chain, your global value chain? I think that's the way to go, number one. Number two is, I think Andrew's comment around, the collective state, which is a very valid, comment that the collective state must operate. We as IDC have told the IPP office, and we work with our DTIC colleagues to say, look, in terms of the IPP program, that would form the base of any facility within South Africa, manufacturing facility. There must be some level of local content. We've impressed on them, but obviously they have their own independent view and, their own other matters that they've got to consider. But it's not something that we haven't brought up, publicly, even privately, if I can ask. But I think the main thing is to have collaborative engagement with foreign OEMs rather than trying to, compete at this stage. Thanks.
Great. No, thanks so much, Keegan, and I think thank you for all the contributions from all the panelists. I think it's been super rich. Really, in terms of continuing the discussion forward, I invite you to look at 2 key documents. I think in the next couple of weeks, when you have a bit of time, of course, pick up SAREM when it gets published very soon. I think that's really important, but also look at the recently published and approved Africa Green Minerals Strategy, which really is a big blueprint for action going forward and driving implementation into the continent. On that, I thank you again and hand over back to Devin to take us to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Keylor. I know we are a few minutes over time, but big thanks to you and the panelists for an exciting discussion. I think what's evidently clear is that the opportunity exists, and now it's really down to the nuts and bolts of how do we really make this happen. And I think the SAREM really gives us the blueprint in terms of where we need to be aiming for, and the G20 platform and the Africa Green Mineral Strategy also gives us a fair amount of regional context in terms of what we need to be striving for. So I'm really hoping this is not the end of the conversation. I'm sure we'll be continuing this on a number of other platforms. I just want to end by thanking Annelies and the DTIC team for their partnership on this particular webinar. And we're really hoping that we can continue this conversation on this particular topic. With that, thank you all very much for your time and looking forward to seeing you again.